Well, hello again, and welcome to another video tutorial. Today, we're talking about the question of God from a philosophical perspective. Let's get underway with taking a look at our notes and some other information to help us understand this concept. In Brightspace, you'll notice that we have the notes there for today's information. I'll go right to them and we'll start talking about them. The idea of the question of God usually makes us think about religion or theology, right? But we want to distinguish what we're doing today from theology to more along the lines of philosophy. So, what are we doing? We're doing what we call natural theology with a philosophical approach in critical thinking. So, let's start by differentiating between the two. What is theology? Theology itself comes from the Greek word theos, which of course means God. So theology is the study, science, or knowledge of God. But what is natural theology? Because natural theology is what we're doing today, and that's a philosophical approach to God. Okay? Natural theology does not mean the study, science, or knowledge of God through nature, right? It is true that some of the arguments for God are based on the physical world, meaning nature, but many are not. Natural theology, what we're doing in today's class, is the study, science, or knowledge of God through natural intellect. What do we mean by natural intellect? It means the intellect in its natural state, unaided by any special or supernatural input. Okay, so natural theology is sometimes called philosophical theology and rational theology. That's why we're talking about it today in class. So, philosophical theology or rational theology, we know in critical thinking we're dealing with our rational mind, all right, a logical approach uh, to a philosophical understanding of something. Okay, so we're going to distinguish natural theology from what we call revealed theology. Revealed theology gives us a little help, so to speak, with understanding God, but we're not using that help in natural theology. Okay, revealed theology means the knowledge of God through special revelation, such as the Bible, the church, inspired people of faith, the Spirit, and supernatural acts of God, meaning miracles or when God intervenes in our world. Okay, that's revealed theology, right? Revealed theology is God revealing himself to us, but natural theology is doing our own understanding of God without that assistance, just through our own natural intellect. Okay, in natural theology, people attempt through their own natural faculties to approach God, whereas in revealed theology, God has approached us in his own special way. So this image kind of gives us an understanding of that. With natural theology, it's us approaching an understanding of God. Okay, we're going from people to God. In revealed theology, God himself approaches us. So we understand God by his revealing himself to us. Okay. So we're doing this today. All right. Natural theology, where we are trying to understand God. It is important to note, though, that those who accept both natural and revealed theology do not confuse what people do in natural theology with what God does in revealed theology. Natural theology is more about us. Revealed theology is more about God, at least in the way of activity. Natural theology, if successful, delivers some basic knowledge of God, which may bear on people's philosophical life, such as knowledge of God's existence and his nature. Okay, I come to understand and know God. So most of what we're doing today is analyzing what has come about generally as a result of natural theology. Five arguments for a belief in God, for God's existence. However, in revealed theology, if it's true, it delivers a knowledge which bears on human salvation. So we're talking about something completely different, how God loves us and saves us through his actions. And that's revealed to us in revealed theology. All right, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a philosophical approach to understanding God. So let's take a look at what we would consider to be the 5 major proofs or arguments for God's existence. And of course, we'll mention the objections to those arguments, because not everyone buys into each one of the arguments. Not everyone thinks they're good reasons to believe in God. Okay, and that's why we're talking about it in the critical thinking class, because coming up with an argument about anything is how we do philosophy, how we engage in critical thinking to come up with philosophical answers. And as we noted from our own understanding of what the important questions are in life, the existence of God is one of the most significant and important questions that we ask in life. So it's appropriate that we consider it here. The first major argument for the existence of God is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument is a simple one and uses good reasoning and logic for its proof, but it's not without objections. Okay, here's the argument in a nutshell. It is possible to imagine a perfect being, right? In your mind, try and imagine what makes a being perfect. Such a being could not be perfect unless its essence, or one of its characteristics, included existence. Therefore, a perfect being must exist. So you've got a good argument set up here, right? We can imagine a perfect being. That's one of our propositions, one of our pieces of evidence. And a perfect being couldn't be perfect unless it included existence as part of its essence. That's another claim, another proposition, another piece of evidence, which brings us to only one conclusion. Therefore, a perfect being must exist. I'll give you a quick little analogy of something kind of tangible with this argument. Let's say we're sitting here and we're picturing in front of us the most perfect idea of an ice cream dessert. All right, let's say you imagine it. What's your favorite flavor? Let's say it's strawberry with little chunks of strawberry mixed in the ice cream. Maybe you can almost imagine whipped cream on top, or chocolate syrup or something like that. So imagine that. And you close your eyes and you're imagining it really well. All right, you're saying, wow, that would be awesome, delicious. But then let's say instead of just imagining it, there actually is a real dish of ice cream, your favorite ice cream and topping, right there in front of you. So the question we ask is, which is better? The one you're imagining or the one that's real? Well, clearly the one that's real would be better than the one that you're imagining. So that's what we mean by this argument. Let's watch this video, which elaborates a little further on it.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
All right, so we can see what the ontological argument is really getting at, okay? It's an argument that says if you can think something is logically sound, then it probably is. Of course, the objection is pretty obvious. You can't define or imagine a thing into existence. It either exists or it doesn't. It doesn't exist simply because you can imagine it or define it in your mind. The second major argument or proof for the existence of God is called the causal or cosmological argument. Okay, and that states that everything must have a cause. Okay, things don't just pop out of anywhere. There's something that causes them. It is impossible to continue backwards to infinity with causes because there must have been a first cause which was not conditioned by any other cause. So it's like when you have the dominoes set up, you can't just say the dominoes go back to infinity falling over. There has to be a first push of the first domino for the rest of the dominoes to all fall. So we're saying since you can't go back to infinity with first causes, there must have been one cause that caused everything else, and that cause must be God. Okay, so this is about recognizing that we have something that exists, the universe. Okay, we have the cosmos, the universe that exists. And how did it come to exist? Well, we can go back and back to a point, but there is a very significant philosophical axiom that says you can't get something from nothing. In other words, you can't say that it was always there. Something must have brought it into being. And that would be something that doesn't need something else to bring it into being. So that would be God. Okay? Let's look at how these people express and understand the cosmological argument.
I think we all agree that for everything that exists, there must be an antecedent cause to it, whether that's my own birth or the cake that was given to me for my birthday present, or, whatever, or the car that I'm driving, which I'm delighted with at the present time. I know that it didn't just show up, it wasn't a result of randomness plus time, that there was a designer, there was a manufacturing process, there was a shipping process. And so it seems to me that cause is intuitive for things that really exist in the universe.
And now we are living in a time where this argument really has gained a lot of momentum today, because the accepted view in science today is that the universe, time and energy and matter and all that all came into existence at a finite time in the past. Now, if that is true, they have not always existed. They do point to a reality beyond just the physical, and that reality has to have certain characteristics. Has to be timeless because it created time, immaterial because it created space, extremely powerful, if not all powerful, because of the nature, the vastness of the universe, and it also has to be extremely intelligent given the complexity of the universe. So what kind of a cause would this have to be?
Now, those who used to say the universe was infinite, has always existed, they argue that the universe itself is that primary cause. It's always been here. But ever since the Big Bang, we know that the universe hasn't always been here. And we can look at that in different ways. We can look at that through the redshift by noticing the Doppler effect in the universe around us. The universe had a beginning. Or we can look at it from a chemical argument using the second law of thermodynamics. We know that things move from a state of order to disorder. In order for the world to have as much order as it has today, it must have had a beginning in the past. If it were infinitely old, we would be at a point of infinite disorder. So there's different ways to point out the fact that there was a cause to this universe. And therefore we have to ask the question, what was that cause?
It's a mind over matter type of thing, yeah. Whether or not, is it in the beginning was the word, or in the beginning were the particles? And right now, the accepted view in science is that the particles were not in the beginning, they came into existence. And that just leaves the other option, which is a mind.
When you look at a personal creator like God, then you have an answer that not only answers the question of the beginning of the universe, it then answers all the other questions as well. The best, most coherent explanation that ties in all these facts and ties them in well is that God exists.
So what we're saying then is, of course, that what we have, the reality we have in front of us, is a reality that had to be created, right? Because it wasn't always there itself. If it wasn't always there itself, it had to be something that brought it about, okay? That's the causal or cosmological argument. Well, the objection is that if you allow one thing to exist without a cause, you contradict your own premise, okay? Because what did we say in our first premise? Everything must have a cause. Right? But then we contradicted it by saying that there's one thing that doesn't have a cause, but we already said everything else does. And if we do allow one exception, there's no reason why the universe itself should not be the one thing that exists or originates without cause, okay? Meaning that there was something else besides the particles, besides the matter, that created the matter and the particles to come about. Okay, it doesn't have to be God, it could be something else. Okay, that's the objection. Let's now move on to the design argument. Just because we have something here, that doesn't mean that it came to be what we see now on its own. Okay, so we look at the world and we say animals, plants, and planets show clear signs of being designed for specific ends. So therefore, they must have had a designer, right? In other words, if you just look at, let's say, a rock, you would say, okay, well, that rock could have gotten there any particular way, because rocks are just little condensed matter put together in a harder form that makes it what it is. There's nothing animated or unusual about a rock. But if you look at the living world, if you look at things like how the universe works, the natural order and flow of things, if you look at a human being, the way the mind works, if you look at the way the animal kingdom conducts itself, right? They seem to be things that have a specific design or order to them. Okay. Now the objection is that the principles of self-organization and evolution can give us complete explanations for design. So what we initially used to say was God creating the order and design of the universe has been explained by the theory of evolution, okay, that it could come about that way. But another look at the design argument, it's called the modern design argument, okay, also called the anthropic cosmological principle. And that says that the laws of the universe have been framed in such a way that stars and planets will form and life can emerge. In other words, what we have as an end result in the universe is not just, coincidence. There just would be the chances of what we have being the case without it being done on purpose or astronomically huge. Okay, it's like worse than trying to plan your future on winning the lottery. Okay, it's not gonna typically happen. Okay, many constants of nature appear to be finely tuned for this. Okay, they have to be all like precisely in place for what we end up having. And the odds against this happening by chance are astronomical. Okay, so let's see what the design argument really does tell us.
The design argument for God's existence argues that there is an implicit and explicit design, order, purpose in creation that points to a creator, a purposer, a designer. You can't help but look at the existence of life on this earth and how strong the odds are, millions and millions to one, that everything aligned just perfectly.
Scientists are telling us today that life in this universe is balanced on a knife's edge. There are about 50 constants of nature, and if they were changed to the slightest degree imaginable, life would not be possible. And they are independent of each other, all these constants. And for them to have been put together, for them to have come together to allow life, seems to cry out for intelligence, for intelligence behind the whole process.
How far the Earth is from the sun, it seems to be just the perfect distance. How far is the moon from the Earth? It seems to be just the perfect distance for life to begin existing. Where exactly are we in our galaxy? Our galaxy is the Milky Way. We happen to find ourselves in just the right place for just the right amount of radiation to allow life to exist. Where are we in our solar system? It turns out we're being shielded by an asteroid belt, something we would need in order for life to exist. Gravity has a wide range of constants where it could have been. It could have been one way, it could have been an entirely different way. And in fact, if we took the entire range of constants where gravity could have been set, and we turned that range into a ruler that expands the length of the universe, and we divide that up in 1-inch increments, so we're talking about a ruler, the length of the universe at 1-inch increments, gravity is exactly where it needs to be in order for life to exist. If it were 1 inch one way, everything would explode. If it were 1 inch the other way, everything would implode. And we're talking about gravity could have been anywhere on that ruler, this cosmic ruler. And so we have to conclude the best explanation, again, is that mind, which we have good reason to believe through the intelligent design argument, is tampering with this dial in order for life to exist.
I think the beauty of art, the beauty of, say, the Grand Canyon of the Swiss mountains, or the intricacies of nature, including the way that everything holds together to sustain and validate life or sustain life, are so complex that, to me, I just cannot accept that could be purely random chance and necessity. I really, that takes more faith in my mind than to believe that there's a cosmic intelligence with goodness, power, and grace who designed something in which people made in his image could live.
What the intelligent design movement is saying is that we can identify messages in the world around us. We have the ability to say, okay, this message right here has come from an intelligent mind. Then we take what we've learned, we apply it to the world around us, and we say, wow, this world is the product of a mind. This isn't smuggling theism through the back door. This is just a fact. If we can determine that a mind is involved, and we see that a mind is involved in the universe around us, that's the conclusion. And we should take our conclusions and run with them, not try to predetermine what our conclusions should be. That's bad science.
Okay, so what we're saying then is that to go the other way, to say that it was coincidence or evolution, and that anything could have happened, might take a little bit more from our part to believe than the fact that it was designed on purpose. Okay, of course, the objection says that, well, listen, the odds against all possible universe, the odds against anything that would end up being the end result are equally astronomical. Yet one of them had to actually happen, which is what we have. Moreover, if there are very many universes, then some of these will contain the possibility of life. Even if valid, this argument guarantees only that stars and planets and life will emerge, not necessarily intelligent life. In its weakest form, the argument merely states that if we're here to observe the universe, it follows that the universe must have properties to permit intelligent life to emerge. In other words, this is something the universe just has, right? And it could have existed no matter what. All right, now we go to a little more of a subjective argument, okay, from a little more personal point of view. It's called the experiential argument. In this argument, we say that a very large number of people claim to have personal religious experiences of God. So, therefore, God must exist, right? If you have ever had a personal spiritual moment where you have felt the presence of God, a very prayerful moment or something where you sense the divine kind of presence, then you know what this argument is suggesting. Now, not everyone can claim to have had a spiritual moment, to have heard God's voice speaking to them, but many people have, okay? And in the experiential argument, we're talking about people who, are making claims about having experienced the presence of God. So therefore, God must exist. Now, on the downside, the objections is that we can't assume that everything imagined in mental experiences, like dreams and hallucinations, actually exist. These experiences are very difficult, if not impossible, to repeat, test, or publicly verify. So in other words, no matter how much you want to insist that the experience occurred, it's very, very difficult or impossible to prove that it actually occurred. As a matter of fact, mystical and other experiences can sometimes be explained by other causes, most prominently psychology. If you're a psychology major, you know that the study of the mind is a very complex thing, and there's lots of potential and possibilities for the mind to create realities that we believe are the case, when in actuality they can be explained through the biological functions of the brain. Okay, the only thing that kind of gives this objection a little trouble are experiences that are shared by people. Okay, in other words, it wasn't just one person on their own claiming to see something or hear something or feel something, that it was several people together who experienced the same thing. There are lots and lots of examples throughout history, but one in particular I can mention is an event that took place in northern Africa, in Egypt, in the southern part of Egypt. In this particular town, back in the late 1960s, there was a church, and across the street from the church there was a garage, a mechanic's garage, and there was a guy, a gentleman working, a mechanic working on repairing a bus in his garage, and he looked up one evening at the church, and he saw this woman on the top of the church. And she was kind of like walking around on the edge of the roof. And the first thing he thought was, she's going to fall. So he got out and ran out to yell to her to be careful not to fall, to get back inside. And what he saw just amazed him. Is almost like this figure of this woman was moving. And then all of a sudden she was gone. Now, that would be a personal experience, but as it so happened, on a subsequent evening, when he was not alone, the woman appeared again. And now everyone there was seeing the same thing until the woman vanished. They all looked at one another and spoke and said, "You saw what I saw, right?" Yes, they all agreed. Well, word of this vision spread through the region, and more people began to come. At one point, there were literally thousands of people watching and experiencing the same exact vision. And they were all talking with one another about what they saw. They all saw the same thing. And these were a wide variety of people. These were Christians, Muslims, Jewish people, people who have varying other Christian denominations of faith, people who were Buddhist, people who believed in God and people who didn't believe in God, right? All different kinds of people, all gathering together and seeing the same thing. Now, of course, just because they can concur that they saw something which is quite mysterious doesn't necessarily prove that God exists, but it certainly does prove that it's a very unusual and mystifying experience and vision to have. So there are times when the experiential argument is used not just for an individual person, but also for people sharing the same experience together. Right? Let's take a look at this understanding of it.
The experiential argument for God's existence, I think, is a huge one, and it's a very valid one. I mean, just if we look at this objectively, the vast majority of humanity, from the beginning of time to the present day, believes either in the existence of God, the gods, or something beyond reality. The atheist or the agnostic community are a very small percentage in actual belief around the world. Now, why is that? I think that's because our actual encounter with life, with conscience, and with reality drives us to assume intuitively that there's something.
Our sense of desire, our longings, our aesthetics, our love for beauty, for something bigger than ourselves. It's all these transcendent longings that we have. In addition, it's also people's religious experience. And so again, you look over thousands of years of history and millions of people who claim belief in God. How is that unreasonable, or irrational? It doesn't seem to be. So these are all witness and testimony from our human experiences. We are, for example, finite human beings who have these great transcendent longings. How do you explain that? Longing for legacy, for beauty, for truth, for goodness.
And that's why I think many people come to know God. I think of, for example, my own mom, who was very, very committed to Christ, but she had no idea. She could not read or write. She had never heard of the Kalam cosmological argument, could not give any coherent argument for God's existence. But I can, for that reason, say that she did not know God. And so arguments can actually, as William Lane Craig has pointed out many times, they can actually be a distraction to our coming to know who God is.
A friend of mine once said a man with an experience is not at the mercy of a man with an argument. And that doesn't mean to say that experience in itself is totally exhaustive, but it is part of what we have. I have to account for my experiences. So let me go back again. That when I walked into this house in Scotland many years ago and was shared ideas about the existence of God, I came in completely predisposed. There was no God. In fact, I was morally repulsed by the very notion of God. So there was no experience of God, except that there had been in my childhood senses of something.
Personally, I think it's very, very important. It's hard to convey your experience to someone else, and that's why some people may be hesitant to apply this argument in the understanding. But when we talk about knowing God, a being who's there, if all we are stuck with are just arguments, philosophical arguments or arguments from science and all that, if that's all we have, we are still a step away from really knowing God, which is what God has called us to do.
I think experience is a pointer. It's not exhaustive, but it is something very significant. When you look at the great people across history, from the Apostle Paul through C.S. Lewis to people like William Wilberforce to Ravi to myself to many others, experience is a part of the reason we believe in God. It's not the sole reason, but it is a very important one.
Okay, so what we're saying here is actually a very complex, complicated way of talking about God's existence. And it clearly has a connection to the human experience, the human mind, the human intellect, to our ability to reason and think through things. So it's really a very powerful, big can of worms for us, okay? Because we might say that God created a human intellect in order for humans to know God, right? Know him. In other words, like, if you want to communicate with me, I'm leaving you a phone that I bought for you so that you can contact me and communicate me. So in other words, God granted the human intellect as a way for us to know and understand him through our human experience. Of course, that's taking the understanding of the brain to divine levels as opposed to trying to understand it at the human level. But that's what this argument does. The final argument we're looking at is called the pragmatic, or better known as the moral argument for God's existence. Okay, and that has to do with morality, which we just talked about recently. Now, human societies require ethics to survive. That's right. Without some sense of morality, there would be chaos and we wouldn't be able to survive very long. So ethics are certainly more effectively enforced if people fear God and hell and hope for heaven, right? So there's this system of rewards and punishments that help us to abide by the morality, okay? This comes from the origin of ethical systems. Now, what we're saying, though, is that why do humans act in a moral way or strive to act in a moral way? All right. And this argument says that that's a result of God's influence to make that happen. Okay. Certainly it makes sense as an argument, but it has its objections. All right. First off, the usefulness of a belief doesn't prove it's true. Okay. Just because something works doesn't mean that it's the absolute reality. Okay. It may be an effective way to get people to do something, but it doesn't mean it's true. When we looked at fallacies, one of the fallacies that we mentioned is the fallacy where people are going to intimidate you or coerce you, the fallacy of coercion. In other words, they're forcing you to believe something. Well, even though that's not a good argument, it can be very effective. As a matter of fact, if I were to go and look for a good example of that, okay, Lucy, 5 reasons. Okay, if you remember our good friends Charlie Brown, okay, Lucy is going to Linus to tell him to do something for the Christmas play, and she gives him good reasons to do it.
Put through such agony. Give me one good reason why I should memorize this. I'll give you 5 good reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oops.
Those are good reasons.
Well, that didn't load very well. Let's see if we
Put
can do
through
that
such
again.
agony. Give me one good reason why I should memorize this. I'll give you 5 good reasons. 1, 2.
I guess we need to use another version of it. Let's try this one.
I can't memorize something like this so quickly. Why should I be put through such agony? Give me one good reason why I should memorize this. I'll give you 5 good reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those Those are good reasons. Christmas is not only
Okay, so that's the idea, right? He's being coerced into it. So morality might work because we're being forced into it. That doesn't mean it's a good reason to do it. Okay, so we have to be careful. That objection is a strong one. Okay, that just because something is effective doesn't mean it's true. And in any case, a lot of societies have thrived without beliefs in God. And on the other hand, crime has thrived in societies that do believe in God. Okay. All right. Let's look at a little further explanation of this argument.
The moral argument is one of the most fascinating argument, and for me, I think is the most compelling, because we exist in a universe that has do's and don'ts. It has rules of behavior. There are things we are supposed to do and things that we are not supposed to do.
Every human being has this sense that we are truly and really, in reality, obligated to avoid evil and to do good. Everybody has that sense of conscience. There's this real sense within every human being that there is an ought, there is a moral imperative that comes from somewhere. And it is universal, and so if it's universal, it's not just culturally shaped, even though some morality, certainly we would acknowledge, has some cultural factors in it. But this universal ought, this universal imperative, has to point to something bigger than humanity.
Morality or moral properties have a very interesting feature, and this is they are normative. They tell us how we're supposed to behave, what we're supposed to do, and what we're not supposed to do. And if that is the case, if they are normative, if we have moral duties, not just moral values, things that we have to do, it really does cry out, in my view, for a moral lawgiver, if we do have moral duties.
I can go back to my days before I was a Christian, and I lived a fairly wild life. Now, the idea that I didn't want God to exist was a very key issue in my life, because I didn't want something to impose upon me. But there was a sense at one level that laws as such were just the imposition of society. They were the imposition of parents or schools or authorities or the police. And only suckers believed that. And yet, when someone did something wrong to me, I was betrayed in a relationship very badly, and I was deeply angry. In fact, I wanted to go and beat the people up that were involved in this, because I wanted justice for the wrong that was done to me. So even in my non-believing state, that there was no God, there was no morality, there was a moral conscience badly orientated that I was following in some sense.
Another society may disagree with those very laws. What we say goes for our society might not go for other societies, and a much more recent contemporary example is, of course, what we saw in the Holocaust. We saw the most educated nation at its time come to a point where it was systematically exterminating those who they thought were weak. Now why? We have to ask the question why. If we jump straight to the idea that they were depraved monsters, we're missing out on key information here. The conclusion here was that if we are just meant to survive, if that's our whole purpose, then we ought to make ourselves as strong as a society as possible. So we're going to weed out the weak. It's our moral imperative to weed out the weak. There is no way we can conclude the Holocaust was wrong if we are cultural relativists, if we believe morals come from our own culture or society. But we know, as we showed in the Nuremberg trials, we know what they did was wrong, and we're willing to say that.
Okay, so these are our 5 arguments for the existence of God, as well as the objections for them. But the question of God goes deeper and further than this, and it's a continual question that we ponder and think about for the entire existence of our life. Thank you for your attention today, for joining me and following along with this most interesting of questions. I'll see you next time in our next video tutorial. Bye-bye.